How many people has George Bush killed and murdered in Iraq? 100,000 or more?
Oh, no, not at all. The latest estimate is about 1.3 million civilians.
1.3 million people
right.
murdered by the Bush administration in Iraq.
Those are called excess deaths. In other words, if you look at the death rates in Iraq before 93, 2003, when we invaded, and compare them to the death rates, there are 1.3 million more deaths than there were in the years preceding. Right?
And then we should add all the people killed in the first Gulf War,
yes.
because that was unjustified too. Remember when the Senate was voting on the first Gulf War, we had the woman testify about the incubators, and the Iraqis were throwing babies on the floor, and we found out that was not true later, but that was the justification for the first Gulf War. And then his son goes and fights again in Iraq on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, and that also is not true. There are no weapons of mass destruction.
Well, and Clinton killed 1 million people in Iraq. I mean, let's not just bush this up. Clinton's sanctions looked at in terms of excess deaths, killed 1 million, 500,000 of which were children. And you may recall, this is a very famous moment, that Leslie Stahl interviewed Madeleine Albright, the ex-ambassador to the UN and then Secretary of State for Clinton, and said, 500,000 dead children. What do you say about that? And this is on television. You get this clip all over if you Google it. And she said, yes, it was a very difficult decision, but we think it was worth it.
How can it be worth it to murder 500,000 children?
I mean, any rational person with a heart and a soul would ask that question. So we're talking about people that are, I don't know what they are. I mean, it's very hard to give an answer to that question.
And let's remember that she said this after we had already found out that the woman had lied about the incubators, and that the justification for the first Gulf War was...
That wasn't the sole justification.
But it was the reason that the Senate voted for it. Otherwise, it would not have been voted for.
It was one of those theatrical moments that were used. But the justification is what the justification always is, which is American power politics and the desire to control the Middle East.
And to steal their oil.
For that purpose, and to, be positioned with respect to Russia and China. Yeah, I mean, that's still going on. It's going on under Obama.
But let's get back to the French Revolution, since you're writing a book about it. The terror that we were taught in school that was so horrible, that 40,000 people died. And of these 40,000, the majority of them were the aristocrats, the nobility, who had been oppressing the people for so many years.
No. I mean, that if that's true, it's not, it would have to be traced out. The nobility, there are two things about the nobility that, one is how, by and large, supportive they were of the reforms of the revolution. Maybe from fear, maybe from a sense of the new possibilities of the age, maybe from discontent with Versailles and what was happening with the palace and Marie Antoinette and not wanting to be involved with that scene. And Louis himself, Louis XVI, was a very weak king. And so there was a whole move on the part of the aristocrats, on some part of the aristocrats, to support the goals of the revolution to one degree or another. So it wasn't just let's go after the aristocrats at all. As things got going, and you had the committees of public safety determining who was arrested and who was to be guillotined, after the guillotine, who was to be executed, then what they were looking for primarily were counter-revolutionaries. Now, some of the counter-revolutionaries clearly were aristocrats. They were aristocrats trying to flee the country so that they could organize in England and Germany to bring foreign armies against the French Revolution, right? And there were that, and there was a whole very, very important paranoia about we're being attacked. It was like after the Russian Revolution, the whole world ganged up on Russia. We couldn't have communism. Oh, well, we can't have the revolution. We need kings. We need the nobility. So yes, there was a lot of extraneous foreign organizing on the part of the nobility, and especially the nobility that were sneaking out of the country to organize. And, you know, obviously the King of England was very interested that there still be kings, right? And the lords of Germany.
We can get lost in the small details here, though, and say, you know, there was Lafayette, or there was one noble that, for instance...
but I'm not trying, I'm trying to pull back from the details. What I'm trying to say is that the common understanding of the terror as being a revenge against the nobility is not correct. The terror was about counter-revolution. The nobility were one part of counter-revolution. But there was a lot of counter-revolution on the part of church people. There were counter-revolutions in the Vendée, in Lyon, all about the church, because there was a big, people didn't want their church taken away from them, you know. Some of the clerics swore allegiance to the new regime, to the people. And some, what do you do with the Pope? You know, so there was that element. There was nobility, there was the clergy, and then there were the bourgeoisie that were not the sans-culottes, that were not the peasants that were up and, you know, rising up with pitchforks in the country and all of that. And
these were wealthy bourgeoisie that
well,
were
wealthy
also
and
oppressing.
middle class bourgeoisie, who were being looked at very, it was kind of like McCarthyism, you know. People were being charged with being counter-revolutionaries. Counter-revolutionaries. What were you doing before the revolution? Da, 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 da. Many, across the classes, the major thrust was to stop the counter-revolution, because here they had this incredible thing going that could change not only France, but the world. France is a model for this enormous worldwide city of brotherly love. That's what it was called, the Philadelphia Project.
It did change the world. It was the impetus for the Russian Revolution and then the Chinese Revolution.
Right. And so what, like the Russian Revolution, you know, what they were afraid of was people who wanted to stay the same, to keep things the same, to keep the power structure the same, right? And that was what the terror was about, to stop that, to stop the possibility of counter-revolution.
But let's look at what the French Revolution produced. In France today, education is free for everyone, all the way through medical school. It's a principle of the revolution. Now, for the past 200 years, the French have had free education.
Well, in Europe in general.
But especially in France. In other countries, they have certain restrictions, but in France, it's an absolute principle that education is free.
And here it's a business.
Yeah. And what else did they do? They freed the slaves. Now, this is 60 years before the American slaves were freed. And then what else did they do?
Well, they didn't have slaves in the sense that we had slaves. What they did was empower largely the bourgeoisie, but dragging along behind them were the villages, I mean, and empowered them to be heard what the problems were. What were the problems? And there was, they brought together the Third Estate, which was largely bourgeois, which was largely made up of lawyers, but, you know, it was a counter to the nobility, a counter to the clergy, the other two estates. And the most important thing that is still essentially without change and without challenge is